Next, more from Arizona and the 2023 Tucson Festival of Books.
Our panelists today are Philip Bump, Malcolm Nance, and Will Sommer, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. This session is called The Prognosis for Democracy. And I want to start, first of all, by welcoming you here on behalf of the organizers and also for the donors who have organized this. We want to make sure that you recognize also the leadership of our volunteers who are here and those who have contributed their energy. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we're not able to hear.
Okay. Thank you. I'll lean in a little bit more, too, as well.
There we go.
So I'd like to thank you all for that, and I'd also like to acknowledge that at the end of this session, we will have an opportunity to do the book signing. The book signing location will be right nearby, and volunteers will direct you there. But I want to jump into it. My role as moderator is basically to introduce the authors and then to make sure that all the authors have some equal time to talk about your books. We're basically going to be focusing on, how did we get here? What's the history of this political crisis that we find ourselves in the midst of? How are we to understand the political crisis that we're living through? And then what's the prognosis going forward? And I just want to start off by talking briefly about the books. The three authors, the two of the books speak pretty directly to each other. Malcolm Nance's They Want to Kill Americans, the malicious, terrorists, and deranged ideology of the Trump insurgency in America, or as he generally will talk about it, the Trump insurgency, really speaks about how the Trump insurgency came together out of broader historical movements dating back to the militia, the Patriots movements, the anti-tax movements in the 60s and 70s, but really came together with January 6th and the election denialism, and then the violence that has continued. His book overlaps with the second book that's on our panel, which is by Will Sommers, and that's Trust the Plan, The Rise of QAnon and the Conspiracy That Unhinged America. I think many of us are kind of surprised that this incredible QAnon conspiracy that has liberals wanting to drink the blood of children to stay immortal, how this moved from the fringes of society and what we might dismiss as a lunatic fringe to, according to latest polls, 41 million Americans support or at least identify with some of the QAnon conspiracy ideas, including members of Congress who are openly avowed QAnon. Now, Malcolm's book on the Trump insurgency also touches on QAnon, so we'll have some good opportunities for them to talk about conspiracy theories, and Malcolm's previous bestseller books have focused in on the history of ISIS and the Russian disinformation that helped to contribute to the 2016 election outcome. So he'll be able to talk about radicalization and some of those other aspects of it. And our third book is by Philip Bump, and it's kind of a biography of many of the folks looking out in the audience here, the biography of our generation. It's called The Aftermath, The Last Days of the Baby Boom, and the Future of Power in America. And the history of our generation, I think, is something that will help us to think more broadly about the political moment. And the future of power in America, I think, will give us something to talk about at the end of the session. So with that, I want to turn it over to our authors and start off particularly with Philip, because yours is more broadly focused. How does the history, the kind of biography of a generation that you provide, with all the detailed information and the interviews that you include, how does the biography of the boomers help to explain this mess that we find ourselves in?
Sure. Yeah, and I want to be very clear that when I talk about the last days of the baby boom, I'm talking about decades. That's one of the first things I always want to throw out. So no, but this is and the best place to start is with the boom itself, the baby boom generation, 1946 to 1964. One of the things to remember about the baby boom generation is that it emerged at a point in which immigration was restricted in the United States. About a century ago, there were new limits placed on immigration in the U.S., particularly in response to new immigrants from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and Asia. That was lifted after the baby boom. So the baby boom itself was a very, very native-born American generation, unusually so. Subsequent generations have not been. And so when we talk about the difference between the baby boom generation in particular and older Americans more generally and younger Americans, one of the key things we're talking about is demographic change. We're talking about an America that is much more diverse these days among young people than it was when the baby boom emerged. And so you can see instantaneously the ways in which that affects our politics. You know all of the ways in which demography is an undercurrent to a lot of the political debates that we have at this point in time. That said, it's worth diving in a little bit. So when we talk about what American democracy looks like in the moment, we talk about this tension between older and younger Americans. The first year, the first presidential election, in which there was a really, really wide gap between how older and younger Americans voted, was the year 2008, which of course was the election of Barack Obama. And one of the responses that we saw to the election of Barack Obama was the emergence of the Tea Party, which ostensibly was about taxation, but I think anyone who's paid attention to the scholarship understands was really about concern about changing America. It was concern about immigrants coming to the United States. It was concern about where people's tax dollars were going and if they were going to benefit people who were seen as unworthy of getting that money. It was also, according to people with whom I spoke for the book, it was also about older Americans worrying about younger Americans falling under the sway of this socialist from Kenya, right? There was this aspect of it which was older Americans being like, what is happening? Why are young people, why do they find this guy, who is this Barack Obama? Why are they voting for him? And that really helped accelerate a lot of that tension. It is not the case that the baby boom generation is a broadly conservative generation. I think people in this room are cognizant of that. But the baby boom generation is a massive, massive generation. That's the point, right? The scale of it is really, really huge. And so when we talk about, particularly on the right, a political right which is heavily older compared to the political left, which skews much younger, we're talking about a movement which is much more densely populated with older Americans. And so then that reinforces this idea that older Americans are more conservative, which isn't the case. You know, as I said, the baby boom generation is fairly evenly split. But now we come to this point. We come to this moment in the United States when we're really trying to determine, are we going to be a pluralistic democracy? Are we going to be a democracy where people, no matter what their background is, if they are citizens of the United States, if they're black, if they're Hispanic, if they're Asian, are they going to participate equally in the United States democracy? Which has only happened since the 60s, right? It's only happened since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Are we going to uphold that? And there's pushback. And this is a moment of tension that overlaps with generational divisions, but there's a moment of tension essentially between a very heavily older and whiter America and a younger and more diverse America, which leads to all these debates that we see manifested in all sorts of different and toxic ways.
Now, in addition to the demographics that you talk about in Aftermath, you also point to the history of technology. I mean, those of us who are boomers, we were the television generation, and we're about to hand over to the largest, we were the largest generation in America, but just in recent years, it's now millennials. And millennials are really the internet generation. So how has that also contributed to the current situation, the current malaise that we're experiencing?
Well, there are two ways, and I know that the other panels will talk about technology to some extent. There are two ways, though. One is that when we talk about the heightened tension that we sense between generations, part of that is rooted in technology, right? There's a great quote from a guy who was talking to Harper's that I cite in the book, in which he says, you know, you can sit in your bedroom in Cleveland and get 1 million followers overnight. And that's true. You can, you know, some kid can go ahead and just create something on TikTok or on Instagram, and millions of people can see it within the span of 24 hours. There is an ability of younger people, a younger generation, which is very vocal and very diverse and very different than the older generation, they can speak directly to their elders in a way that when boomers were young, they couldn't do. They had to work through gatekeepers. You know, yes, they certainly could have protests and hope that it got covered in the San Francisco Chronicle, but it's very different now. And there's a presence that young people can have in the lives of older Americans, which exacerbates that tension. Then, of course, there's the aspect of social media, and social media breaking down. You know, when we talk about gatekeepers, we're talking to some extent also about broadcast television. We're talking about newspapers. We're talking about these institutions which were the ones that collected information and shared it. And now people can share information directly with one another, which obviously has its plus sides. It also has its downsides, because people can say, oh, you know, all the liberals are drinking the blood of children. Don't you agree with that? And everyone can say yes, right? So there is that downside to it, too. I know you guys are going to speak to that as well. But this idea, the idea that young people can manifest in their lives, you know, obviously, when we talk about generational tension, I was inevitably going to say it, but OK Boomer. What is OK Boomer? OK Boomer was born of a TikTok meme, in which boomers started adopting TikTok and going on TikTok, and young people were irritated because they didn't want to see this, what they call cringy material on TikTok, and so they would respond to it and say, OK Boomer, right? But that is exactly the point. It is this use of media to confront and accost power, the power being over.
Okay, so if we think about, you know, white Americans, the aging anxieties of white Americans, and the America that they were born into is not the America they live into, and then we think about the change in our information systems, this kind of brings us to reflect upon how did the Trump insurgency kind of coalesce and become such a dominant power in American life? How did it happen that conservatism got overwritten by Trumpism, and the Republican Party is, for those who have identified with it, it doesn't look anything like what it looked like 20 years ago. Malcolm, your book really helps to explain that. In addition to the demographic changes that Philip talked about, and the change from television and the information commons to the internet, what other factors do you think contributed to what you characterize as the Trump insurgency?
Well, I think that a lot of people who are in this room, certainly we're all boomers here, maybe not you, Philip, but crazy kids. We all remember Carroll O'Connor as Archie Bunker in All in the Family. And Carroll O'Connor's character, which, by the way, that was him acting. He was a radical left, progressive American, and he wanted to showcase just exactly how this body of a white American working class male lived. But if you recall that show, it allowed for him to change by being impacted by his son, Rob Reiner, or son-in-law, Rob Reiner, his daughter, right, and his wife. And for those of you who remember the show, the most traumatic event in the entire history of that show was when Edith tells Archie to stifle himself. Right? Do you remember that moment? I was like 12, and everything in my house froze. But the waters that were buffering Archie Bunker, that brought him to moderate his big mouth, which in that show used words we can't use today, right? So I thought about that for a long time when I was writing this book. And I realized that there was something going on that was just bigger than demographics, all right? Yes, there's going to be a decrease in the white population due to an increase in the people of color in the United States over a period of time. And I'm certainly, I'm sure that when Barack Obama was elected as president, and I say the same thing, it was a big catalyst in the movement that led directly to Donald Trump and what would become what I call Titus, right? The Trump insurgency in the United States. But the thing that I found that played the most, and I'm sure someone's a political psychologist out there will eventually write a book about this, is not so much that Donald Trump was representing their generation or even their demographic. It was what he was saying, how he was saying it resonated with this body of America who probably saw Archie Bunker as a hero. And I called this, we entered into a phase that I don't think we've ever seen before, and that's pure political tribalism, where Donald Trump became the avatar of the white working class American, which, by the way, when you look at the polls about who really supports him, it is not the lower middle class whites. It is upper middle income whites, what they call the people who have a boat, who have an extra house, a beach house, or something like that, who are still working class, contractors, professionals, things like that. And they saw him as a tribal chief. And when you have a tribal chief, there's virtually nothing he can do or say so long as he is leading you in the direction that you want to go. And therefore, when he says something that's outrageous, well, they cheer because it's outrageous, because they want to say it. And what we call wokeism in the United States now, which the Republicans are bandying about, in the old days, this was called common decency. And but when Barack Obama got elected president, the political lines in the United States shattered. Yes, white union male voters of that demographic voted for him, but he did not speak for them. He spoke for the union. And we saw the attacks on the unions take place while he was president. And then they realized Donald Trump speaks for me because he says what I believe. He says what I want to say. There's that old New Yorker cartoon of the sheep who were in the valley, right? And there's a big billboard, and it's a wolf in a suit, all right? And it says, "I will eat you." And this one sheep says to the other, "I like him because he tells it like it is." Apparently a lot of you don't read the New Yorker. But that tribalism, when you have a tribal sheikh, right, a tribal chief, the funny thing is I worked in the Middle East my entire career, right? You don't have loyalty to that person. You have loyalty to the chain that leads up to that person. And he promised them their version of America will dominate everything else. He also promised that elections wouldn't mean anything because they're already stolen, they're already taken. He also promised that essentially that all the benefits of government would be bestowed upon them and not all the tax cheats and the Negroes and you women with your uteruses making demands about things, right? And that he would give guns more rights than your uterus, which they have successfully done. He is a sheikh, right? He is a tribal chief. He is a warlord chief. And so long as he says what he wants and is decisive, right? The last guy, I mean, we've seen guys like this before. Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, all right? They led their countries to total ruin. But still people joined the military as 1,000-bomber raids were leveling Berlin, right? I mean, it's just absolutely amazing how when you speak not to that common decency, the actual precepts of the Constitution of the United States. I'm from Philadelphia. I always put this in my books. I'm a purist about what was written in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. I believe in it. And even Thomas Jefferson said, you know, this is a living document. These things must change according to our progeny. But they didn't promise that. They promised there would be one way in America, and it would be the way of the people who vote for me. I will take away from everyone else, and we won't govern America. We will rule America. And you saw during after his election, he ruled for 35 to 40% of the country. He didn't care about the other 65%. He was literally taking resources from other 65%. He, like we said, you know, with ISIS and Al Qaeda, he learned the language of radicalization to make them feel like they were special. And that's where you get, it's not just about guns, right? I collect guns. It's about the guy who said in Portland, Oregon, when do we start getting to use our guns? When can we start killing people? These people have been radicalized to believe that the movie of the 1980s, Red Dawn, that the United States was occupied by the commies, which are now the Democratic Party, leading to this explosion in the crazy political conspiracy theory, which Will Sommer, I don't know how he wrote a whole book about this, because QAnon is crazy. And that's a professional intelligence term I'm using. All right? That craziness, 41 million Americans. My book was about, I had predicted in that book that QAnon would take over the Republican Party, base ideology in 6 months. It happened faster than that. Faster than that. And now we have Americans here who they don't believe in medicine. They don't believe in government. They don't believe in elections unless it's their election. I mean, we're sitting sort of in the heart of crazy, right? I mean, No, really. When I wrote that book, They Want to Kill Americans, the question was, who's they? And they are your neighbors. And in Arizona, that means a lot.
Malcolm, so let's use that as the lead-in to our
Yeah. That's a lot. Thank you.
Will Summer is going to talk about, I mean, if you can imagine any demographic in America that might be more challenging to strike up a conversation with, I can't imagine any group more challenging than a QAnon. And you spent a lot of time talking to them, including Baby Q, who claims to be Q from the current time, getting voices from the future Q. And oh, by the way, he lives in a compound outside Phoenix.
Yeah.
Well, tell us about what you've learned with interviewing people who believe in QAnon, and tell us how this lunatic fringe became a mainstream political movement in America.
Sure. So, yeah, I think we can build on here what Malcolm said. I mean, if we look at the future of American democracy, QAnon can initially seem like sort of a weird internet thing. I mean, it certainly is, right? But it's also really sort of laying the seeds for its believers in a sort of fascist takeover of America. And to just, lay it out, I mean, if you've been kind of scared to look at QAnon, concerned it's too complicated. In the book, I try to lay out the sort of the basics of it. Very briefly, QAnon believers, they've used a series of anonymous clues from someone that they believe is close to Donald Trump, perhaps Don Jr., Michael Flynn, to create this worldview. And strap in here, right? Okay? So the keys to it are that the world has been controlled for thousands of years by a cabal, and now the people who run this cabal are in the Democratic Party, in Hollywood, in banking, and there's obviously a lot of anti-Semitic overtones here as well, right? I mean, like George Soros is this great villain for them, and they think that this cabal, it causes all the wars, et cetera, it creates disease, and that someday Donald Trump will come, or essentially this moment called the storm, that Donald Trump will come and essentially like create a fascist utopia in America for Trump supporters. And so when Malcolm talks about this idea of really punishing people who aren't on Trump's side, that plays into it. And so they think that this cabal drinks children's blood to stay young, all this kind of stuff. And yes, I mean, there are a lot of people who believe this. And as we saw on January 6th, it really powered a lot of the insurrection. A lot of people who were killed that day were QAnon believers, and were convinced that day would be the storm. And so you might say, now that you know what QAnon is, right? How does anyone believe this? And so in the book, I travel across the country, I meet with QAnon believers, and try to get into the effects it has and why people get into it. And often it's, people can, in a weird way, they kind of trace their own radicalization. They have a lot of insight into why they got into it, but they think it's real, so they think it's okay to be into QAnon. And so it's often, a disease that they don't have insurance for, and they think that perhaps, Trump will release the cure for this disease when he sends Tom Hanks and Barack Obama to Guantanamo Bay. All of these like really irrational ideas, but you can kind of see the motivation at the heart of them. And so since we mentioned the Arizona connection here, so there's this guy named who ran sort of a faction of QAnon, and he built a compound, or he lived in a compound with his believers, and the FBI was involved, and there are all these guns. And one of his followers' sisters called me and said, can you get my sister out of this group? And I mean, absolutely unqualified to do that. But I did go out there and try to get to the bottom of it, and it's very bizarre. And the thing is, you mentioned, okay, this guy believes in time travel. He says he's Baby Q, whatever. You might think, well, at least he's off in his compound, right? He's not affecting politics in Arizona. Well, stay tuned, because after he gets out of jail for various issues, I then go visit him in Phoenix, and he says, yeah, I just got done, I was working on the audit recount, right? And so this is a guy who is handling these ballots, and then, he's running a congressional campaign, he was giving speeches to state senators. So this is really, I mean, you guys know this better than anyone, this fusion between the fringe, whether it's QAnon or something else, these militias, all this stuff, and the Republican Party, I mean, is really real, and certainly here in Arizona.
Can I make a quick comment onto that? He pulled his punches there about Q. Okay, the storm is the day they're supposed to mass murder every liberal in America, also known as the Day of the Rope, which was taken from the Order, the book, the book that Timothy McVeigh, the Turner Diaries, had used. And they were supposed to hang all white liberals. They were supposed to kill all people of color, and they were supposed to sterilize the United States. And people thought January 6th was the storm, which is why the first people in the building were wearing Q shirts. Yeah. And they thought they were going to, I had said this on MSNBC that night. There are what we call murder cells in there. Some people in there are there to kill. And they are going to work their way in there. They're going to let the crowd work their way, and they're going to kill or rape government officials. Kill, rape, and kill government officials. But this is the crazy part.
So one of your arguments, Phil, is that the boomers created America. So can we blame them for QAnon?
Yes. Good night. Thank you, everyone. No. Yeah, that's quite a setup. Look. Here's the way I would describe it. When we think about why is the Republican Party giving space to these folks, right? And it's easy to have an ungenerous answer to that. But the answer, I think, really fundamentally is that the Republican Party understands that its ability to gather power is limited with a younger population that is very much more sharply liberal and democratic than previous younger generations. They are not making any inroads. I talked to Michael Steele, the former head of the Republican National Committee, and his argument essentially, we lost them. They're gone. We're not getting those young people back. If you're not getting young people back, then you have to quadruple down on the people you can get. And who can you get? You can get psychos who are like living in the desert and like QAnon, right? No, I mean you can't. I mean QAnon is also great. Not everyone who adheres to QAnon adheres to Malcolm's vision of it. There are sort of entry-level QAnon levels too, right? Where you can sort of get in. No, sincerely. And so there's a lot of people who adhere to those simple ideas that the liberals are bad and they are evil and that they must be stopped. And when we think about Donald Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," what's he talking about? He's talking about the white America that he visualizes from the 1950s and 60s, right? He is appealing to that aspect of America, which is very concerned about how America doesn't look the way it used to. And so when you combine these things, when you combine that the Republican Party is limited in its ability to outreach to younger people, when you combine that with this very, very potent appeal to what America used to be, this political nostalgia, and then you layer in all the craziness, right? You actually have a contingent of people who can compete for power, and was enough to carry the Electoral College in 2016.
So, Malcolm, when you talk about the Trump insurgency, you sometimes roll it all the way up to all Republican voters.
Yeah.
Now, there may be some, I sense we have a pretty friendly crowd for some of these arguments. But for those people who might be Republicans, if they wandered into perhaps the wrong session, and they're kind of looking around and they're wondering, this is another kind of conspiracy. I'm not identifying with some of this way of thinking.
Yeah,
How do we build a majority that's more expansive, that includes and sustains relationships with the independents and the moderates who are actually responsible for the Democrats winning the last election? If we stay fixated with the Trump insurgency, how does that carry us into the future?
Well, first off, you can't ignore an imminent and immediate threat. And we have already seen this threat manifest itself. We've seen people knock down power for 100 and 200,000 people in North Carolina just a few months ago. They went around and shot the power plants. I wrote 4 different incidents where that occurred in the last 5 years in the United States. It's part of this whole, militia belief system in there. But full disclosure, I was once a Republican, right? I was a Colin Powell-style Republican, right? Strong on national security, socially liberal. We now on the XY axis come down way in the lower left corner over there with Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. Where Republicanism has moved today is so far off the charts that the people who they call constantly rhinos, you mentioned Michael Steele. Michael Steele's not allowed to come to any Republican, party reindeer games. They just don't want him. They don't want anyone who does not espouse the tribalism of Titus, the Trump insurgency in the United States. And to answer Philip's question, he made a very good point of that. It's the energy of these people. You're right. Some people may come into it because they're anti-vaxxers. Other people may come into it because they believe that aliens are coming and that Donald Trump is a hero rescuing children from pedophiles and saving them from having their blood drunk, which is all of these are QAnon absorbed all these things. But when I say the Republican Party, I mean the Republican Party of today, this minute. Okay? Wendy Rogers level Republican Party. All right? As I like to say, crazy with a capital K. All right? And, you know, but they have moved so far away from conservatism, right, to pure tribalism. Why they just don't change the party to the Trump party in name is beyond me. You have now the same people, you have the Ron DeSantis's of the world and others who are espousing pure Trumpism, which is a full, wholehearted step into fascism, right? I mean, DeSantis the other day is trying to pass a bill where no writer or blogger, anyone who gets paid, even if it's like a newsletter, that can criticize him, right? I mean, it's just wait for that to pass. Minute 1, second 1, I'm going to hit transmit, right? And I'll take it to the Supreme Court. I mean, but the point is they're not just moving the Overton window, all right? They are knocking down the wall and creating, you know, the Overton French doors and allowing as much crazy to come in there in order to overwhelm common sense and common decency. You, the majority of you, on the other hand, who are here, are clearly nice people who have a lot of common sense.
All books, Malcolm.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, they just saved this state, right? For the most part. Which will motivate the crazies to be even crazier. You know, so that being said, you know, and I know we're going to be on C-SPAN tomorrow. They're going to ask me this question, and I'm going to look into that camera, and I'm going to say, my family has defended this nation nonstop from April 1864 to today, and you don't represent any of those values that were espoused when I lived in Philadelphia, all right, where when I was a kid could go to the Independence Hall and ponder what the meaning of why I was allowed to participate in this country, in this government equally, whether you liked it or not, even though we had to fight. They don't believe in that anymore. Not at all. Be quite honest, I don't even think they're American. I think they're Trumpist.
Malcolm, so let me turn this over to Will. You spent a lot of time talking to people who are really hardcore conspiracy. You know, how do, you know, some of the people in this room, I'm sure, have brother-in-laws or cousins or nephews, perhaps, that are also caught up in some of these conspiracies. How do you talk to these people? How do you understand the way back in dealing with some people who are deep into these conspiracies?
Sure. I mean, this is a very difficult question. And I hear from so many people who have lost relatives, you know, parents, spouses, children, to QAnon and sort of related conspiracy theory movements. And it is really tough, and it's heartbreaking, and I get into it in the book. I mean, it's people, in one chapter, I follow a family for a year as their son kind of gets deeper and deeper into it. And it all starts, there's kind of this moment where the QAnon believer in your life says something a little crazy, and you go, sorry, what? What'd you say? And then, you know, you think they're joking or they're doing a bit maybe, and it's really not the case. And so in this case, this guy, his adult son came in and said, hey, Dad, you know, I just want you to know they're going to be arresting a lot of celebrities soon. You know, it's going to be Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg. They're going to Guantanamo Bay. And the dad said, well, as long as it's not Tom Selleck. I love Tom Selleck, right? And then he thinks, you know, that was kind of a weird conversation. And then, you know, that's sort of the beginning of this family's journey with QAnon. And so when people ask me, you know, how do you get someone out? I mean, in part, it's difficult because I think our institutions, you know, somewhat understandably, have been really ill-prepared to deal with this. And so, for example, this family goes and sees a psychologist, and the psychologist says, all right, you know, this is way above my pay grade. I got to Google this QAnon thing first. And this father goes, geez, you know, this guy can't help us. And so they end up emailing people like me, and I don't have really great answers. But I think, you know, the keys to it are, if you have this in your life, you know, first you have to evaluate, do you really care about this relationship, right? And so it's like, there's someone, you know, on Facebook, you know, like block them, right? Because it's a long journey. And so, but you know, if it's someone really close to you, if it's a spouse, what have you, you know, you try to get them offline as much as possible, which is not always easy, but you know, if there's something that they enjoy doing that's not connected to conspiracy theories, you know, go do that. And then, you know, you kind of just try to maintain that relationship up until that person snaps out of it on their own. And that, that's easier said than done. But often when I talk to these ex-QAnon believers, there's something kind of clicked in their heads, and they would see something that was to them a proof that, this whole conspiracy theory was real, and then suddenly something happens. Like, for example, when Biden was inaugurated, and then, that was sort of that disproved QAnon for many of them. I talked to one woman who said she wanted to throw up because she just, she had invested so much for identity and so much for reputation into this, and suddenly everyone was seeing that she was wrong on national TV, everyone that she knew. And so, it's a very complex, issue, obviously.
Can I just want to elevate something that Will said there. When you speak to QAnon adherents, the thing you hear repeatedly is, well, you just have to do your own research. And so when he says this thing about taking them offline, they are convinced that they have learned the truth through their own knowledge, that the institutions are lying to them, and that, of course, all they're doing is picking up on things other people have said, right, and using other people as a source of information. But his point there about going offline is absolutely essential, because what they do is they get burrowed in online and think they're teaching themselves what other people don't want them to know.
Yeah, and really so much of this is the result of decades of attacks from the right on independent institutions of fact, right? Whether it be academia, the media, scientists, and
Newspapers.
Newspapers, exactly. Well, thank you. And, it gets to the point where then everyone you might say, well, look, the NIH said this. They're going to say, you believe Fauci, you dummy. And so it just becomes very difficult to pull people out of it because of that. Meanwhile, they'll take something, I was talking to someone and they said something and I said, where did you hear that? Did you hear that on Fox News, the Wall Street Journal or something? They said, oh no, it's where I get all my news, conservative treehouse. What the heck is that, right? And so, it's very difficult to deal with people when the barriers for credibility, they really don't have any skepticism.
So when we think about this as a political and social movement, and we identify it with demographic changes in the United States, that doesn't really explain it because it's a global movement. What we're talking about is a rise of authoritarianism throughout the world. So, Malcolm, you've been on the front lines fighting in Ukraine last year as part of the International Brigade. And your broader program of work is concerned with the international development of authoritarianism. And also, Will, in your book, you conclude by talking about the globalization of QAnon, which seems so American. One cannot even imagine it as an export. But this movement is happening around the world. So I invite you both to kind of, how do we understand this reaction to liberal democracy, which we had thought was going to be the great accomplishment of the 21st century?
In 2018, I wrote a book called The Plot to Destroy Democracy, and the subtitle was How Putin's Spies Are Damaging America and Dismantling the West. And I could, as an intelligence professional, very clearly see that this was a political co-option of conservative political groups all around Europe and in various parts of the world. I had been to Vladimir Putin's office, by the way, when he was a spy in Dresden, just to get the feel for what this guy was doing. He actually admired the East German Stasi police force. He admired the East Germans. He didn't admire how the Russians did it. And he modeled his current Russia being a fascist authoritarian state. And he hasn't gotten to the point where everyone is watching everybody, but he's working his way there. But what shocked me was how much money they put into foreign political parties. Every major conservative movement in Europe was funded by Putin's United Russia. And in fact, there was a plan, and you can just see it as clear as day when I talked to other intelligence professionals. There was a period of time where Putin was going to essentially knock down everything that we had built since we landed in Normandy in 1944. It was going to start with the election of Donald Trump. Then 2 weeks later, the election of the government of Austria, which, by the way, was a party formed by two Austrian SS officers in 1952, right? Hardcore conservatives, they got elected. The minute they got elected, they went to Moscow and signed a political agreement binding them to the United Russia. Then there was supposed to be, at the same time, a coup d'etat in Montenegro. And you probably think, Montenegro, where's that? Just north of Greece, going up past Albania and along the Adriatic coast. why was this significant? Because there's a Serbian majority population. They supported Russia. If they overthrew the Montenegrin minority government, and here was their plan, they were going to kill everyone in parliament. They had men, they had police, they were going to take over the government, wipe them all out, then call for Russia to land troops in Montenegro and give them a naval base right there east of Italy. And then the next thing was going to happen 2 months later, the election of Marine Le Pen as the Prime Minister of France, who was going to withdraw France from NATO, which would have allowed Donald Trump to break up NATO. And it was just so clear. I mean, a 6-month arc. Our world could have changed as dramatically as World War II. But what it really was, and I describe it this way, it wasn't just that he had funded Trump. Yes, he had been, I mean, he broke out the KGB archives that had been monitoring Trump since 1977. And in 2014, when he came to Miss Universe pageant, you know, he broke out those archives. As a professional intelligence officer, I would have said, this guy's going to be easy to manipulate. But he would have created, in a 6-month period of time, a solid foundation of what I call an axis of autocracies. United States, France, Austria, it probably would have impacted the German elections, allowing Alternative for Deutschland, you know, the neo-Nazi party, to take over. Then the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil. The world would have looked very, very different if it hadn't been for the failure of that coup in Montenegro and Marine Le Pen losing to Macron. This isn't just happening in the United States. The Russians co-opted the extremist wing of the evangelical movement with their Saving Christianity conferences in Moscow for the last 20 years. They co-opted the NRA. They put actual spies into the NRA. KFSB officers, Maria Butina, who got to ask the first question ever asked of Donald Trump about, you know, is there going to be friendship between the United States and Russia? It was a spy operation from beginning to end. Ukraine put an end to all of this. Ukraine is the eastern wall of democracy, and our western wall is crumbling, which is why I'm home. All right, you can shoot Russians. That's easy to do. They're fish in a barrel. But what's happening back here is a full-scale, sustained effort to destroy this and to create what Donald Trump and them really believe is a constitutional autocracy, where the trappings of the Constitution exist for those people who are on their side, and the rest of you are going to be treated like slaves.
All right, Malcolm, let's open it up and get some questions from the audience here.
Sorry.
Okay, we've got the first one right here, sir. Stand up and please speak up, and I will repeat your question so everybody can hear it.
This question's kind of for Philip, but it's for everybody. You talked about the boomers and the millennials, but you didn't talk about Generation X.
I did not.
My formative years were spent under Reagan.
Sure.
And I remember 35 years. Oh, sorry. Okay. Hi. I'll start over. So you mentioned the boomers and the millennials, but you didn't mention Generation X.
Right.
My formative years were spent under Reagan. I remember 35 years ago standing outside of this building pushing pamphlets for Michael Dukakis, But, the boomers overwhelmingly supported Reagan. It was a landslide against Mondale. So the hippie boomers supported Reagan. It's refreshing to see the millennials with their activism attitudes, but you see them moderating. What do you see for the future?
Yeah, so in 1984, everyone voted for Ronald Reagan, right? I mean, he won by a million. I mean, he won overwhelmingly, right? So I get this question about Gen X a lot, and my easy cop-out answer is I'm a member of Gen X, so I get to do what I want, right? But essentially, the reason I don't talk about Gen X a lot is simple. It's because you had the baby. Let me put the scale of baby boom in perspective. 1945, there's 140 million Americans. Over the next 19 years, 76 million babies were born. Right? More than 50% of the population in 1945. It's a boom. Like, we don't understand the scale of the baby boom, right? And so what happened is you have this massive boom that ends, Gen X, and then millennials. And the simple fact is, Gen X never really was able to compete for power against the baby boom. There just weren't enough of us, right? The millennials are. Also, we didn't have the same competing interests as the millennials do. So right now what we have is, over the course of the baby boom, what happens, right? You have all these babies born, you got to build new schools, you got to hire new teachers, you got to build more colleges, you got to find more jobs, and the whole thing swells as the boom comes along. And now we've gotten to the point where boomers are starting to retire. So we've got to figure out senior housing, we've got to figure out Social Security and Medicare, we've got to figure out these issues that are now important to seniors. But now we also have a large young generation that's competing for resources and power. Gen X was never in that position. And so, God bless us, I love Gen X, but we are just not part of this intergenerational tension story, especially what's manifesting now.
Yeah. Next question, right here next to you, right in this third row. Right here. Then we'll come back over here.
So my question is about the opposition. Why does the Democratic Party still operate like they're in 1970 and talk about reaching across the aisle?
Sure. You want to take that, Malcolm?
Yeah, I'm asked this question a lot. Principally because of those of you who know how I speak on television, I speak pretty plainly. I'm an old Navy chief, so I don't have time to play games with words. So I give my message directly and forcefully, and it seems to cut through a lot of the fluff that you hear. And I think the Democratic Party is right now focused on the traditions that we have always had of maintaining comity, right, within the House of Congress, not raising their voices, trying to get as much cooperation as possible. They don't want to seem tribalist, right? But we're beyond that. We're way beyond that. I watched Chuck Schumer the other day say, "Oh, we're going to do a bunch of investigations," and it reminded me of a cartoon that was on, I think it was Cartoon Network, where they had Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer making a motion for lunch, and it turned out to like a 3,000-word document in which they called upon all parties to go to lunch. It's just like, for God's sakes, just cut through it. And I think we're seeing some of the younger members who have had enough, the Eric Swalwells, right? We're just like, okay, that's it. I'm done with that. So that when they see, serious crazy thrown out, you have to address that immediately, directly, and forcefully in as few words as possible. When Marjorie Taylor Greene, I had a friend who ran against Marjorie Taylor Greene, and he tried that, but he couldn't get the traction over her crazy, right? His Army sergeant, said, "Hey, she's nuts," right? Everybody just agreed, so she got reelected. So, and I think that's what we need to understand, is that we're dealing with people who think that they're coming into an institution and they want to maintain the traditions, the grace, the dignity of the institution. Okay, armed insurrectionists were coming to kill you in many instances. Now it's time to speak up for America. That's how I do it.
Next question.
Can I add very quickly? Sure. Part of it, too, is that the politicians are very superstitious in the way that, like, athletes are. And so if you got to a particular place by doing particular things and running on particular issues, that's what you keep doing. Your campaign consultants say this is how you win elections. One of the things, the most important things that's happened in the course of the past 6 months when we talk about generations is the fact that Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer stepped down. And the reason they stepped down is because they recognized, A, that Democrats are a very young party, and they're very frustrated with seeing baby boomers and silent generation people at the top of their party. But they also did it because they recognized that the issues that they ran on, the issues that a lot of baby boomer liberals ran on and fought for, are not the issues that are motivating young people, in part because the boomers were successful. And so what do young people today fight for? LGBTQ issues, climate change, gun control, right? Things that were not as salient to the baby boom generation. And so stepping aside and creating space for those new leaders also gives space to new issues and new tactics.
Another question. Right back here, and right here on the aisle, and then right behind the person. The next person back.
Hi. First of all, thank you for a compelling panel. This question is mostly for Will. I found it very striking when you were talking about some of the motivations for QAnon folks, like brain cancer or, untreated mental health. And I'm wondering, in your experience, if there is overlap between these unmet societal needs and falling back on conspiracy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and at the end of Trust the Plan, I make the point that, I'm certainly not the policy expert here, but as you say, I mean, so often you can just see the direct line between some sort of social misery that's visited upon someone and sort of a broken safety net, and then the moment where they say, you know what, I think I'm going to get into QAnon. And so, there's a guy in the book who's part of this Arizona group who had this disease, and he was rejected for disability, and that was the point where he was just so mad at the world, and I think understandably so, that he went online and then he saw Donald Trump and he said, no, here's a guy who sees all the problems and who's going to get a sort of revenge for me. And then from there he got into QAnon. So I think really, when people talk about how do we get people out of conspiracy theories, or how do we, increase information literacy, I mean, ultimately I think the thing to do is just to make a better society in general, that, so people aren't immiserated in this way that they often turn to it. And, I shouldn't say, obviously a lot of people deal with serious issues, with debt issues, this kind of stuff, and they don't turn towards conspiracy theories. And so it's not always that this person is such an innocent who kind of stumbles into it. I think there is like a nasty element to it as well. But often I do think it is those kind of holes in the social safety net.
And right behind this last speaker, please.
Hi, thank you all. I have a math question for you. Each of you, what do you think the probability is that Trump will win the nomination?
Oh, yeah.
And if he wins the nomination, that he will be our next president?
All right. Okay, I'll start. On the evening of November 8th, 2016, I swore I'd get out of the prediction business. The odds are good that he can win the nomination. I think that the more Republicans who get into the race, I think that Ron DeSantis has never had a real challenger. He had a fight in 2018, but now he wasn't like attacked for his current policies then. Trump's going to throw everything at him, real or fake. We know how that works. And I think that the Democrats, if I am a leader of the Democratic Party, do I want to see Joe Biden run against Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump? I don't know, but I think probably Trump, just because so many people have already rejected him. So many Republicans are like, oh God, like really a lot of Republicans. I mean, yes, there's a lot of, Trump isn't a powerful strain, but a lot of Republicans would like to move on from Trump as well. Not a majority of them, but the odds are good.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo that, I mean, I think when people say, oh, do you think Ron DeSantis is going to beat Trump? I really encourage people to watch Ron DeSantis give a speech or two. I mean, this guy, he's a charisma black hole. And it's just when you consider a guy who's going to be up against Donald Trump, I mean, the news today is that Trump he's workshopping new nicknames. He's talking about Tiny D or like Little D. And, it's not terrible, right? And so it seems as though Trump really has, I think, found his footing where he's like, I'm just going to tear into this guy. And it seems to be working thus far.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Trump does have a good chance of getting the nomination. The more people that get in there, dilute the message, and the energy of the Trumpist wing of, the Trumpist party, right? What I call the Titus. It has energy, real energy. They'll come out and they'll support him, these rallies and, going out where he does these speeches. That's energy, and that's what they really want. They will go and knock doors. They will go and make phone calls. And if you're given those options, and a guy like Ron DeSantis, who's trying to be like Trump, but like he said, he hasn't been tested at all. He hasn't. And then when Donald Trump starts tearing into you personally, right? The question is, do you want to lose the Trump voters that put you into office? That will guarantee that the next election you'll lose because they now hate you? He'll pull a full Ted Cruz, all right, where a guy insulted his wife in his face. You or I would have punched him in the face on the stage, right, and walked away laughing. Ted Cruz, kisses his ring. I think that's what Ron DeSantis will do in the end.
Yeah, right, babe. Go ahead.
You talked about propaganda, and I'd like to hear what we need to be doing to counter that.
The question is, what about Russian propaganda? Malcolm has written a whole book on this and touched on it in another one of his books. And what are we supposed to do about the Russian misinformation that influenced our prior elections and no doubt will influence future elections?
Yeah, stop worrying about the Russians. They're done. Their influence campaign was for 2016. It worked. It was completely, wholeheartedly taken up by the Republican machine. All right, and QAnon, I mean, it's an order of magnitude way more powerful than anything the Russians put out. So their process was amplify Donald Trump, attack Hillary Clinton. We found that out. Then Donald Trump took it up to discredit that by saying, oh, Russia, 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 Russia. I still get death threats from people like, you said lies about Donald Trump and Russia. It's like, really? Really? There's this huge book called The Mueller Report. And we didn't even really look into his espionage-related activities. You're right now, don't worry about the Russians, really start worrying about your neighbors. And no, I'm not joking. The people who vote, who are the voters here who, will never, ever quit or want to overthrow government or take over the school boards, go to the school board meetings. It's now down to the activist level.
So one last question, and I want to bring it back to the panelists to give a prognosis for democracy. So here, the last question. We got one back here, too.
Yeah, we'll give you one.
All right, we'll give it.
The radical right is so energized, and there are so many more, I hope, sort of us than of them, but I think we're all sort of subject to normalcy bias to some extent or another. And how do we get that same energy level going in resistance to that radical right?
Will, why don't you jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there is this. The advantage often is on the people who are most enthusiastic, even when they're a minority. I mean, you think of all these book bannings, right? And people get they get so obsessed with banning certain books. And then for the average person, you have a job, you have a family to deal with, and you just sort of say, all right, I guess if you want the book out so badly, we have a whole library. But I mean, the reality is, I do think it's up to people who have not been politically engaged in the past or just voted, to take more of a look at this local level. I mean, because really there is so much passion and intensity among the far right and these conspiracy theorists. But then again, the good news is obviously there's a lot of normal people, right, and a lot of people with good thoughts, for the country, and as we saw in the midterms. So I guess that would be my take.
Phil, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, remember the midterms, right? I mean, what was supposed to happen based on historical patterns? What actually happened? Don't sell short the pushback from normal America.
One more question.
Oh, can I just get a quick answer on that real quick? Where I live in upstate New York, we had a congressman who was completely absent named John Faso. So the Indivisible group there fashioned a action every Friday called Faso Friday. Guy never went to his office for 4 years, right? I mean, 3 years. And so they had people come there, and it became the largest pizza party every weekend, to where it went from a few dozen people to hundreds of people every Friday. It was an event. And the Republicans, especially the Trumpistas, right, they had those events. Remember the Trump truck parades? Every Friday in my district, or every Saturday in my district, they would meet at the Safeway and gather and talk. You have to be just as active, and you got to bring whoever is the youngest member in your family. If you got an 18-year-old that's turning over, explain to them why it's important that they vote. Ask them if they want to drink nasty water. Ask them if they want to burn, because there's climate change. Ask them, if they, want to, do things like be forced to marry the woman that they get pregnant. Sounds radical, but we're living in, it's almost like The Handmaid's Tale is a documentary.
So one more question back there, and then I want to give the panelists a couple of moments to conclude.
Back up.
We've got a couple more.
People's champ out there.
Why don't you get the conversation going?
Oh wait,
here she is.
this guy's been waiting here.
So we'll give you both a chance to ask questions.
We'll be quick.
We got time.
IC member, go Army, beat Navy. But with all the traits of QAnon, it is predicated on belief. It's motivated reasoning. Has there been any attempts to de-radicalize through some of the, approaching it as a belief system as opposed to as a logical system?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at it, it has a lot of characteristics of a religion. There's so much faith in it. People have called it a cult, for example. I think there's a lot of great research out there, but it is so complicated. And just to be quick about it, I mean, it's a great question. it's people believe it for such personal reasons because it's so broad and people are drawn in for so many reasons. It's very complex.
Yeah, and his book title just sums it up, what they kept saying to each other. Trust in the plan, trust in the plan. It's a belief system, and I think it is going over to religious cultism like Om Shinrikyo and some of these other violent cults.
So one last question here, and then we'll be out of time.
I just want to know, it's confounded me for about a week. I've always voted Democratic, and last week I got a large manila envelope with postage stamps all over it from Jim Jordan with a 3-page, I call it a manifesto, but it was, I know they were asking for money, but why was I on a list like that?
It was sent to you directly?
Yes.
My guess is based on, Arizona has party registration. When you register, you have to sign up for a party, yeah? My guess is they were just taking a shot in the dark and figured maybe you'd donate because you are, potentially in the demographic that they were targeting. Or they just messed up.
Or
like, this is not rocket science, right? I mean, these, a lot of political consultants, they probably said, hey, let's pad the numbers, sell more to Jim Jordan. I don't know.
Okay.
It's nothing, no fault of your own, I assure you.
Yeah. And, yeah.
Did you give them money? So, no, I don't think they did.
All right, so please join me in thanking the authors. And I think she's actually stepped out, but I also wanted to thank Maria Parnham, who put this panel together along with the other political science and current affairs with a whole group of people who spend the year reading books and engaging and deciding on these sessions. There's a lot of invisible labor around here, behind the scenes here. So please join me in thanking folks